Here are 3 interesting facts I learned about crime in Sweden. Number 1, crime in Sweden is increasing generally. Number 2, bombings and grenade attacks are common, and they're increasingly common. And number 3, self-defense in Sweden is kind of limited. So on the first topic, crime in Sweden is increasing. Crime in Sweden has been increasing, and there are 2 main ways that I know this. First is Sweden's annual Bra crime survey, and second is statistics presented by the courts of Sweden and made available on their website. Sweden's annual crime survey is published once a year, and there are around 70,000 respondents or participants. Participants are asked whether or not they have been a victim of different types of crime in the past year, along with a few other questions. The crime survey is not a count of crimes, it's not a number of crimes that were committed, but instead it's a measurement of the proportion of the population that was a victim of crime. So we may know that X% of the population was a victim of crime. Here are a few excerpts I'd like to share with you from pages 4, 5, and 14 of the English summary on the 2019 crime survey. Offenses against an individual. In 2019, 26.4% of the population state that during 2018, they were a victim of one or more types of offenses referred to in the report as offenses against an individual. Those would be assault, threats, sexual offenses, robbery, etc. This is an increase as compared with the preceding year, which is 24.7%. So in 2018, 26% of the population was victimized. In 2017, 24%. So crime is up by 2 points about. Victims are up, I should say, by 2 points about. The proportion of victims has increased for almost all types of offenses against an individual compared to 2017. There are a couple exceptions to that. One notable exception is sexual offenses. That's because they really peaked in 2017, and then there was a mild decline after that. Another highlighted point that I thought was interesting is that 25% of them, and here them means people who were the victim of crimes, 25% of them, or 6% of the general population, state that they were victims 4 times or more. Individuals in this group account for almost 3/4 of all incidents of offenses against an individual. In other words, there's this really small group, 6% of the population, that absorbs 74% of the crime. So that's just a kind of a specific interesting thing about crime, a sub-interesting thing about crime. A very small marginalized group is absorbing really disproportionate amount of crime. Let's see. And the other point I'd like to mention here while we're reading the crime survey is that a total of 80% of the population believe that the number of crimes in Sweden has increased over the past 3 years, which is a small decrease from 2018 when the proportion was 82%. So 80% of people say, I think there is more crime in Sweden. I think crime is increasing. 80% of Swedes, more or less. So this tells us, in other words, that the number of crime victims is going up. It was 26%, now it's 28% of the population is a victim of a crime last year. And a small portion of the population, 6%, are the victims of almost 75% of all crimes, and that the general public accurately perceives and has perceived that crime is increasing. So crime is increasing, more people are victimized, and the public knows it. So the other way we know that crime is increasing in Sweden is by looking at statistics from the courts of Sweden. And they make this data available on their website. They offer annual statistics as to the number of offenses in different categories. And the Swedish government also publishes statistics on the total population of Sweden in each year. So with these 2 statistics together, we can create a crimes per 100,000 people graph. In other words, what we previously looked at with the crime survey was just the proportion of the population that was a victim. What percent of the people are victims of a certain crime? But what we can look at with data from the courts is just how many crimes happen, period. And if we combine the court data with population data that the government of Sweden also makes available, then we can just see how many crimes per 100,000 people there are. So I've created a few graphs to help illustrate that. And on this graph, the x-axis is the current year, and the y-axis is the number of criminal instances per 100,000 people in the Swedish population in that year. So this first graph is going to be for all crimes. So this is anything that could be considered a crime. This includes serious and minor offenses. And these are crimes per 100,000 people. What you see is a pretty clear upward trend. It starts fairly low in 1950 and then just kind of rises after that over time up to 2019. So we can see the same graph as this graph which I just explained to you for crimes of murder and rape. Now for murder, the statistic that I'm actually going to use is the category that the English translation from the Swedish courts calls murder, manslaughter, and assault resulting in someone's death. I picked this measurement category to get around the complexity of different categories of murder. So what would be considered manslaughter in the US, or what would be considered manslaughter in the US is if you unintentionally kill someone while doing something that could foreseeably result in their death. So if you are beating somebody up and they fall and hit their head on the pavement and die, that might be manslaughter in the US. In Sweden, it would be assault resulting in someone's death. So the category that I'm calling murder generally here is actually this broader category of murder, manslaughter, and assault resulting in someone's death. This quotation mark was in the wrong place. And yeah, I picked that just to get around the ambiguities of different types of murder. Completed murder, manslaughter, assault resulting in death. For the rape crime, what I'm actually showing is the category of aggravated rape. And that's because Sweden has a very expansive definition of the term rape, which includes actions which non-Swedish viewers may not recognize as rape. So Sweden has some variety of an affirmative consent law, and they have just a broader definition of rape generally than other countries. So I'm using only aggravated rape, which is a stricter subset of rape. So here's the graph for murders per 100,000 people. Again, this is an expansive definition of the term murder. If you were to search for Sweden's murder rate and look at similar kind of graphs that are available on Wikipedia, or just Sweden's murder rate per 100,000 on Google, you would get numbers that are about a fifth of this. And that's because I believe those statistics are reported with a more strict definition of murder than the broader definition I've used here. Notably, this is including the assaults resulting in death figure. But you can see around 1950 to 1960, we're looking at a murder rate that's about 1 per 100,000 people. And then that's going to gradually trend up. And then the trend accelerates around here, where we're just kind of breaching the 5 murders per 100,000 people rate. And just for comparison, the US would be about here with 5.5 murders per 100,000 people across the US generally. So that's giving you some context. I think 1950 to 1960, 1970s Sweden was incredibly safe. Looks like something must have happened mid-1960s in Sweden. Perhaps some criminal or gang war. But yeah, Sweden's getting increasingly dangerous from the perspective of murders, moving towards a country like the United States. And this is the similar plot for the crime of rape. And again, it's going to have a pretty similar trajectory to what we just looked at. 1950 and 60, it's low. It's under 10 rapes, aggravated rape per 100,000 people. It's going to breach the 10, gradually trending up. Around 2000, it's really going to launch upwards. I didn't look up the statistic. I probably should have, to see what it is in the United States, just for comparison. Yeah, if you know, leave it in the comment section. So these graphs all show a vaguely similar trend. In the 50s and 60s, crime was relatively low, and crime has increased in more recent decades. Rape on a per population basis is about 8 or 9 times as frequent as it used to be, murder about 5 times, and crime in general about 6 times as frequent. And that's going from the 50s and 60s to present day, 2019. One major thing to note about the graphs I'm showing here, I alluded to this earlier, is that they're substantially different from what you might see on Wikipedia. The Wikipedia page shows much more mild upward trends. In particular, the murder rate I'm imputing to Sweden is far higher. On my research, I'm showing about 5 to 5.5, which is comparable to the United States, compared to what you would see when Googling for Sweden murder rate. I mentioned a possible explanation for that. At the moment, I'm not perfectly certain of that. I think I need to do further research to kind of dig into why other sources report a different murder rate than what I'm reporting here. But again, my data for the Sweden murder rate comes directly from the Swedish government. So I'm pretty confident in the accuracy of my source. I think there's probably just a difference in terms between how graphs on Wikipedia or the search results on Google define murder versus how I've defined it here, which is a bit more broad. So crime in Sweden is increasing. The next category, the next interesting fact about crime in Sweden is that bombings are increasingly common. Here's an excerpt from the Wikipedia page on bombings in Sweden. This crimes category is very new in Sweden. It was not even logged prior to 2017. In 2018, there were 162 explosions, and in the first 9 months of 2019, 97 explosions were registered, usually carried out by criminal gangs. So let me stop here and think about that for a second, because 162 explosions in the first 9 months of 2019 sounds like a staggering number. I don't even remember the last explosion that happened in the United States. I have a feeling, I hope that would make national news or local news, or at least. But I don't remember, I don't recall ever hearing about explosions. I recall hearing about shootings, certainly at the national level and rarely at my local level, but I never hear about explosions. So the fact that there are 162 explosions seems like a very staggering, shocking number. And indeed, it's new to Sweden, and it's not common in other countries as well. We'll get to that. But it's just a surprising number. And the other thing I want to point out is that they say here that these are usually carried out by criminal gangs. I think that's actually going to turn out to be a bit dubious. As we'll see later, almost none of the bombings are solved. There's about a 10% solve rate for bombings. So it's just a bit of a reach to say that they're usually carried out by criminal gangs, because you don't know who is usually carrying them out. You don't know 90% of the bombers, so you can't say that they're usually carried out by anyone, because you don't know. You don't know who is doing it. According to criminologist Amir Rostami, on the hand grenade explosions, the only relevant comparison is Mexico. So this is what I alluded to. Explosions are not common in other countries, except possibly for Mexico. According to Swedish Police Commissioner Anders Strandberg, no international equivalent to Sweden's wave of bombings. These attacks occur in both rich and low-income places. Swedish police do not record or release the ethnicity of convicted criminals, but Linda H. Straff, head of intelligence at National Operations Department, says they are from poor areas, and many are second or third generation immigrants. The mainstream Swedish media are normally accused of not showing these criminal acts in their daily news. They excuse this as this would bring a feeling contrary to the Swedish immigration policy. So there's a bit of inconsistency there. For example, one person says, National Operations Department, Linda Straff, says these are from poor areas, and the other person says, Anders Strandberg, the other person says that they happen in both rich and low-income places. So a bit of inconsistency. I think that's to be expected because, as I mentioned, about 90% of bombings go unsolved. So it's clear why there would be some ambiguity in terms of the bombing. Here is the fact that I was mentioning. An article on the Swedish news site Svenska Dagbladet, I don't know how to pronounce that, I apologize, claims that more than 90% of the bombings are unsolved. An article in the BBC News reaches a similar conclusion, saying 1 in 10 of such crimes, meaning the bombings, in 2018 has led to a conviction. That statistic makes me question how Swedish criminologists can be so confident that the bombings are perpetrated by gangs, given that the bomber is seldom identified. The bombings are connected, in my mind, to the rising crime statistics that I mentioned earlier. It's easy to hear about rising crime trends and overstate or exaggerate the situation, making Sweden seem like it's some kind of Mad Max dystopia in your imagination. So you can hear, hey, crime is rising in Sweden. Crime is 5, 6, 7, 8 times more common than it was in 1950. And you could imagine, oh no, Sweden must be this bombed out, smoldering ruin. But in actuality, if you consider Sweden relative to other countries, it's still a relatively safe country compared to most other places on Earth, although it's increasingly becoming more like more dangerous countries on Earth. It's increasingly becoming less safe, I should say. And so likewise, the bombing campaign can seem dire. The bombing campaign in Sweden can seem dire until you consider another kind of surprising fact, which is that almost nobody is killed by these explosions. So there have been 160 some explosions this year, nobody killed by them. In my research, I only found that 2 people were killed by bombings since 2015. And both of them were seemingly innocent bystanders. I'll speak a bit more about that in a second. One person was a 63-year-old man who unintentionally picked up a grenade. I believe he was biking by and saw the grenade on the street, and he picked it up and was killed when it exploded. And the other person was an 8-year-old boy who maybe was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think reading the news articles about the 8-year-old boy's death, I think it's also possible, or it's a possible theory that the boy was intentionally killed as kind of a gangland vendetta where they were killing someone's family. That's possible. Or it's possible the boy was accidentally killed. So when you hear about this epidemic of explosive attacks in Sweden, it's easy to imagine that it's some kind of terrorist campaign. If you hear there were 160 bombings in Sweden, you might think of terrorism. But that doesn't actually seem very likely given the small number of casualties. It actually seems like the people responsible for the bombings are trying very hard not to kill people. Because how else could you explain 2 deaths amidst hundreds of bombings in Swedish cities? So why then are there so many bombings? What's the point of them? Here's an excerpt from a Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention in 2019 report on shootings in the criminal milieu. This report is an English summary of a series of interviews with Swedish criminals asking why they committed crimes, especially shooting, or particularly shooting. So this report is not going to be exactly on our point because it's talking about shooting instead of bombing, but I think it's going to be relevant, especially this section here on violence as power currency. So let's see. Quoting, "Thus, it does not appear to be the conflict itself, drug debts, girlfriends, or sales territory, which is important. The interview subjects state that the people in the criminal milieu watch every step they take, and in the battle for position, everything matters. As a result, people also take things very seriously. Consequently, many interview subjects see gun violence as an investment in their own criminal career, since the violence is a way of building up one's reputation and thus strengthening one's position. Reputation, the fact that others know your name and what you are capable of, is associated with profit, such as the possibility of gaining more influence over the local drug market. At the same time, reputation is short-lived and easily lost. Consequently, it must be maintained and defended constantly. Conflicts and shootings can thus be useful in the competition for position and power, both on the drug market and in the criminal milieu as a whole." The interview subjects explained that more or more serious violence must be used in order to advance or protect one's own position. They also say that young peripheral participants in the criminal milieu are more likely than before to take the chance of advancing by shooting. It might be possible to say that what the interview subjects describe is a sort of inflation process. More violence is required to achieve a specific effect. So, in other words, perhaps the reason that Swedish criminals like bombings is because they are an intimidating way to demonstrate to other criminals how violent they are. They can credibly demonstrate that they're willing and able to kill people by setting off a bomb, by blowing something up. And if the bombers are both careful and lucky, they won't even have to actually kill somebody. So you can make it look like, hey, I'm willing to kill you. I'm going to blow up your house. I'm going to, blow up the street, blow up your car. But you don't actually have to kill anybody. But you do credibly signal that you're willing to kill because you are setting off a lethal explosive in a city. And then add on to that the fact that 90% of bombers are not even identified by the police, and you have a relatively low-risk way of making a high-impact statement about your willingness to use violence. So you can establish yourself in the gangs, you can gain a reputation, and you can advance your career in the gangs, in the criminal milieu, as the Swedes say. So Wikipedia provides a list of 63 Swedish bomb attacks that have happened since 2015, which is obviously an incomplete list. More than 100 have happened this year, but that's what Wikipedia has. So I graphed the targets of these bombing attacks, and that's represented below. And so what you can see is that the targets are predominantly residences, small businesses like restaurants or nightclubs, and then the police. So here, residences make up about 52% of bombing targets. Restaurants, nightclubs are a common target. The street is the 23% category. Then we've got the police, about 7% of the time. The police are the targets of bombings. Nightclubs, about 7%, and restaurants. And I should say here that for street, I just also included, this is things like parking lots, sidewalks, people's cars. I called that the street as well. The police, sometimes they'll throw grenades at police stations. Sometimes there was an event where a grenade was thrown at a police van where policemen were in the van. That could have counted as either street or police, although I counted it as police. And yeah, nightclubs and restaurants, I think of as small businesses. I probably could have combined that category. So small businesses are possibly explained as a target as part of an extortion attempt. So for example, you could say, hey, that's a nice restaurant you got there. It would sure be a shame if someone blew it up. And that might be a reason for why Swedish criminals are bombing small businesses, for example. Residences may be an extortion target too, or it could be the result of a vendetta between gangs, claiming territory, frightening people, or demonstrating your capability to commit violence. I'm reminded of a note that the author of Freakonomics made when he was describing gang activity in Chicago, and he observed that gangs would sometimes walk into each other's territory and just shoot guns in the air to make people nervous, and that would kind of frighten people in the area. It would signal that they were under threat, and it would drive off people who are there to buy drugs because they wouldn't want to be in an area where shooting was happening. So it's possible that there's a similar kind of idea. Maybe people who are buying drugs don't go to a neighborhood if it's been blown up recently. I don't know. That's pure speculation. And then finally, I said that attacking the police may be a way to backfoot the police, or to protect your territory from them, or to demonstrate how crazy you are. So if you want the police to stop investigating you, you could make them spend their time recovering from bombing attacks, or you could make them afraid to investigate you because they'd be afraid of being blown up. So the final point I have here about crime in Sweden is that self-defense is pretty limited in Sweden. So I first got to thinking about this when Peter Sweden, who's a YouTuber who discusses crime and immigration in Sweden, albeit with a bit of an alarmist tone, he tweeted a link to a story about a burglary in Sweden. And the story actually turned out to be about a year old. I don't know why he's tweeting about it now, but it was an interesting story. So what happened was a burglar who was armed with a gun entered a home and fought with a grandmother and a 7-year-old boy who were in the home. And, in this fight, the burglar winds up putting the barrel of his gun into the 7-year-old boy's mouth, at which time an adult man who is also in the home, presumably, I presume at least, the adult man was the boy's father. He entered the scene and fought with the burglar. And the burglar was injured. I couldn't see that he was seriously injured, meaning I don't think he was permanently disabled, but he was hospitalized in the fight. And yet both the burglar and the father were arrested. So it seems pretty surprising to me that a father defending not only his own home, but his own son from a man with a gun in his son's mouth would be arrested for fighting with the burglar. And the father didn't have a weapon. He just fought with his bare hands and injured the burglar, but not life-threateningly. So these are pictures from the scene. The pictures weren't labeled, but I think we can safely guess that this guy covered by the blanket is the would-be burglar being taken into the hospital here. And this person kind of being led off by the ambulance is the father. Seems like kind of a, he's 2 paramedics wide. So you could imagine this father hospitalizing this would-be burglar. And the father is going to be arrested as well. So the reason the police arrested the father is because self-defense is limited in Sweden, Wikipedia's summary of the self-defense laws says that self-defense is justified if you're being attacked or about to be attacked, if someone is using force or threats to stop you from recovering property, if you've caught the thieves you're recovering property from red-handed. Self-defense is justified if an intruder enters your house or someone refuses to leave your home after being told to. So those all seem pretty reasonable to me. However, your use of force is limited by two principles. First is the principle that you can only do the least violent thing available to you. So if someone's punching you and you have pepper spray and a gun, you'd be justified in pepper spraying them, but you wouldn't be justified in shooting them because you have a less violent alternative available to you. You have the pepper spray available to you. You don't have to shoot them. So that's one principle that limits your use of force. And the other principle would be that what you are protecting has to be at least as valuable as what you are putting in peril by exercising your defense. So if you catch someone stealing your wallet, you can use force because you caught them red-handed stealing it. And you can say like, hey, give me back that wallet. And you could push them probably, or you could, grapple with them to try to take the wallet back from them. Because you aren't really putting anything at risk. You're not jeopardizing their health or putting their life at risk or anything in order to protect your wallet. You're authorized to use force, and you're not putting anything at risk that's worth more than your wallet. But in the Swedish system, you would not be justified, say, in stabbing your would-be thief, because by stabbing them, you are risking the thief's life, and their life is more valuable, according to the Swedish laws, than your wallet. Of course, I'm not a Swedish lawyer, so don't take, what I've written here as legal advice. If you find yourself in Sweden, I don't know what you should do. I can't advise you. I'm not a Swedish lawyer, but this is my understanding from what I've read about laws in Sweden. So there's a post that I also thought was interesting from Law Stack Exchange, which gives a fictional example. So the questioner on this post asks, I'm reading a fictional book. It takes place in Sweden. There's a situation presented that strikes me as implausible. A female character is being stalked by another character and receives emails suggesting violence and also has her property damaged. Also, she has proof that someone entered her home when she was not home and stole things. In response, this character sought to arm herself in her home with golf clubs in various parts of the house. The thought was, in case of another forced entry, she could bash the guy over the head with a golf club. Instead, she was encouraged to have armed security, because if she killed the intruder under Swedish law, she could very well be charged with manslaughter and possibly murder if it could be proved that she placed the golf clubs around the house ahead of time. Is this true? Can a person be convicted of murder or manslaughter if they kill an intruder that they suspect of ill intent? It seemed implausible to me. So I agree, it seems implausible. A woman who thinks she's being stalked puts golf clubs around her house. That seems pretty mild to me. But the response, the only upvoted response and the approved response on the Law Stack Exchange forum talking about this says what's actually pretty consistent with the rest of my reading about self-defense in Sweden, which is that the criteria is if the force used was blatantly unjustifiable. By placing golf clubs, the stalking victim is preparing to respond with violence to a threat which is not imminent. There are other things she could do instead, like engaging a security guard, or putting screens on the windows and deadlocks on the doors, or having a friend stay over, or telling the police. She is certainly at risk of invalidating a self-defense claim. Putting the golf clubs around the house indicates that she is planning to use potentially deadly violence in response to an attack, rather than reacting with violence proportionate to the threat in the moment. You cannot use deadly force to prevent a break-in or theft, only to protect a life. So it's consistent with what I was saying earlier, what I've read about self-defense in Sweden, but it's also just kind of a striking image or thought to have that something so mild as securing your house by distributing golf clubs around it might be an indication to the Swedish legal system. And again, this is from a novel and it's from a Stack Exchange forum, but it's potentially true that distributing these golf clubs around your house might be an indication that you're planning to use deadly force. In other words, you're preparing to resist someone who's not directly threatening your life necessarily with deadly force. So you're putting at risk more than you're protecting, because by hitting them with a golf club, you might kill them, whereas they were only breaking into your house. So there's also a more famous example. Sweden's restricted self-defense laws are why even if people are following you around the street, if they're harassing you, if they're squaring up with you, you aren't justified if you choose to fight them. And this is what happened to the rapper A$AP Rocky. And it's why he was convicted of assault when, I think, in a different jurisdiction, this would probably be considered something like mutual combat, depending on where you are in the United States, meaning, both of these people are acting kind of aggressively, but they're fighting and they're only fighting with each other, and it's all kind of proportionate and reasonable. I think in the United States, at least in most states, an altercation like this would probably be understood as mutual combat and not assault. And I think of that as kind of a subset of self-defense. If people are saying fighting words to you, they're walking around after you, they're kind of threatening you or menacing you, then I think I would say morally, and I think in many jurisdictions legally, you would be justified in actually, escalating things to a physical fight if they were willing participants in that. So that's what I have. Those are the 3 facts I learned recently about crime in Sweden. I hope you enjoyed learning about them from me. I've made this video this way as opposed to my former style because it obviates the need for video editing, and the style of video is a lot easier for me to produce. Basically, I don't have to edit the videos. So please share your thoughts about the style of the video and the content of the video in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, let me know by clicking the like button. If you want to see more content in a similar style, go ahead and subscribe. Thanks for your time.